What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run 2 programs called Inner Knowing and Good Life Designed for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals on tools and frameworks for creating an intuitive practice and for creating self-mastery in their life. As someone who's helped countless entrepreneurs open doors of possibility that they never thought existed, I've seen these strategies transform people's lives. The best part is that you'll 10x your output, unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly to overcome your limiting beliefs. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition, and set a new framework on how to live your best life. And you'll get access to guided meditations that I have personally created that are not available anywhere else. We'll create a new self-concept that you can practice moving forward. This method is so effective that even if you don't have a lot of time or if you think you're not ready for a change, these frameworks and methodologies will still work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can also check out what some of the previous clients had to say about our time together. It's first come, first serve, and I hope to see you there. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and consciousness. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Ray Dorsey. Dr. Ray Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester. He is working to identify and eliminate the root causes of Parkinson's disease, and his research on brain diseases and digital health has been published in leading academic journals and featured in multiple news outlets. In 2020, Ray and his colleagues wrote the book Ending Parkinson's Disease, A Prescription for Action, and this book provides a prescription for really understanding and ending the world's fastest growing brain disease. Ray also previously directed the Movement Disorders Division in Neurology Telemedicine at Johns Hopkins, and he just has such an incredible background. In 2015, the White House recognized him as a champion for change for Parkinson's disease. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Ray.
Thanks very much for having me, Yasmin. Delighted to be with you.
So, Ray, just to kick it off for folks listening, what is Parkinson's disease and why does this happen?
So as you alluded to, Parkinson's disease is now the world's fastest growing brain disease, even faster than Alzheimer's disease. And it's classically associated with shaking or tremor in the hands, slowness in movement, stiffness and difficulties walking or with balance. And it was first described by Dr. James Parkinson in 1817. And when he described it, he said, I'm describing a disease that's not been classified in the medical literature, something new. And he described 6 people with this condition. 200 years later, the global burden of disease identified Parkinson's as the world's fastest growing brain disease and estimated that at least 6 million people had the disease. So in the span of just 2 centuries, you went from something that affected maybe 6 individuals to something that affected 6 million. In our book, we argue that that can't be due to genetic factors. That has to be due largely to environmental factors and numerous products and byproducts of the Industrial Revolution, including air pollution, certain pesticides, and industrial chemicals, including those used in dry cleaning, are likely responsible for the disability and death that Parkinson's disease is creating worldwide.
Wow. So, can you tell us a little bit more about, the chemicals that kind of are fueling this condition? I know you mentioned a few of them, but, what can we kind of do as an audience in our day-to-day life to kind of reassess like how we are potentially, activating Parkinson's? And also, can we speak about like what exactly happens in our brain, what goes on in the mind, to cause Parkinson's?
Sure. So our brain is only accounts for about 3% of our weight, but it consumes 20% of our energy. It's basically the gas guzzling center of our bodies, and the most energy dependent parts of the brain are nerve cells or neurons. And these neurons account for about 75% of the energy that the brain consumes. And it turns out all those environmental factors that I alluded to, air pollution, certain pesticides, and industrial chemicals, all damage the energy producing parts of cells called the mitochondria. which we know are damaged in Parkinson's disease. So I think what we have are environmental factors that target the energy-producing parts of cells, and the cells that are damaged in Parkinson's disease are very energy dependent and leads to their high susceptibility to injury. And so if you think about it, air pollution, pesticides, and industrial chemicals is basically the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink are really important. Air pollution is a huge factor, not only in Parkinson's disease, but likely also even more so in Alzheimer's disease. It alone accounts for 3 years of lost life expectancy per human on the planet. Pesticides obviously can be found in food, and they and industrial chemicals can contaminate groundwater. So you can imagine if you live near farms, for example, the water you drink is often from private wells, often not subject to the safety restrictions that are normally in place for municipal or city water. People can be drinking in contaminated water for years or even today and not even know about it. And some of these chemicals can actually evaporate from contaminated groundwater and infiltrate people's homes, schools, and workplaces and be a potent source of indoor air pollution that could be fueling the rise of Parkinson's disease even further.
Wow. So, what pesticides in particular should we be kind of careful to stay away from?
So the poster child, at least in the United States, is this pesticide called paraquat. It's considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It kills the weeds that Roundup can't. It was created in the 1960s. And a report by The Guardian, British investigative newspaper, indicated that the manufacturers of the chemical knew about its risks of Parkinson's disease for at least the last 50 years, if not longer. In the 1960s, their own scientists fed paraquat to laboratory animals, and they developed a stiff gait and tremors. About in the 1970s, I believe, they identified, looking at the autopsy of some farmers who had died from Parkinson's disease, and saw that there was a loss of these nerve cells in the brain that produce a chemical called dopamine that we know are lost in Parkinson's disease. And worse, they sought to discredit scientists who were demonstrating the toxic effects of a paraquat. Over 30 countries, including China, have banned the chemical, but the use of the chemical in the United States has increased over the last decade. And for the last 5 years, for which we have records, use of paraquat in the United States in just about every state has more than doubled. It's used in corn, cotton, vineyards, and multiple other crops.
Wow. So, wow. So what can we do kind of as an audience, in terms of shifting policy or kind of, working with our congressmen or congresswomen? Like, what would you kind of tell folks? Maybe this is a little bit, off topic, but I'm actually curious for myself because I certainly don't want to be, susceptible to this.
So there are a few things. One, we need to hold wrongdoers accountable. And if companies know about their toxic effects of their products and they don't withdraw them from the market and they don't seek to make a safer alternative and they seek to double down on their, quote, blockbuster product, we should hold them accountable. And the reason the Guardian was able to write this report is because there were lawsuits in the United States by farmers, for example, who developed Parkinson's disease after having worked with paraquat. And those lawsuits led to lots of information that the companies had to file in their defense. And the investigation of those records led to the Guardian report. And if people haven't read it, they should go just Google the Guardian plus paraquat and read about it. Second, we need to ask for representatives to ban paraquat. The EPA, as early as the 1970s, was considered doing so, but it hasn't. The three countries until last year, when the manufacturers of paraquat withdrew it from Canada, the three countries with the highest rates of Parkinson's disease are the United States, Canada, and Argentina, and all three had permitted the use of paraquat. To my knowledge, the United States and Argentina still do. So we need to tell our representatives, both the United States and around the world, to ban this chemical. And then if you live in rural areas and you get your water from a private well, you should have it tested. Unfortunately, at least in the United States, private wells aren't regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they're infrequently tested. And when they are tested, they're often just tested for the presence of bacteria and not for the presence of pesticides like paraquat or presence of industrial chemicals like trichloroethylene. So if you're getting your water tested, I would make sure that it's tested for pesticides and these industrial chemicals to make sure that the water that you're drinking, your family's drinking, your children is drinking is safe.
Wow. So Ray, what locations or which locations are most kind of prone to the dangers of developing Parkinson's based on some of these environmental issues and pesticides that we spoke about?
So there's numerous studies from various different parts of the world, including Canada and France, for example, that show within rural areas that have the highest use of pesticides have almost a perfect correlation with having higher rates of Parkinson's disease. In science, you almost never see perfect correlations. So when you do, you sit up and you take notice, and that's happened in Canada in the 1980s. And in France in the 21st century, where they looked at the use of pesticides among vineyards in France and found those areas that had highest use of pesticides had the highest rates of Parkinson's disease. But pesticides really can't explain all of Parkinson's disease. It seems to be that, at least in the United States, that the rates of Parkinson's disease are higher in urban areas than they are in rural areas, at least in different parts of the country. And so that's where I get worried about air pollution, which obviously tends to be higher in urban areas than rural areas. But I also get worried about this industrial chemical called trichloroethylene. It's a widely used dry cleaning chemical. It was found in typewriter correction fluid. It was used to decaffeinate coffee. It used to be used as an anesthetic for pregnant women. And it contaminates up to 30% of the groundwater of the United States. It's the same chemical that contaminated the Marine base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. For those listeners in the United States, if they've been getting lots of advertisements about Camp Lejeune and cancer or Parkinson's disease, it's because this chemical trichloroethylene, a very simple 6-atom molecule, is known to cause cancer and is associated in research studies with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease.
Wow. And what about, in terms of like the cities that are most at risk? I mean, I know, because I think we briefly spoke about Los Angeles, for example, but I'm curious if you have like an idea of which cities, come to mind. Are they the most urban cities in the U.S. that are most susceptible?
Yeah, so we don't have great data that pinpoints it, but I'll give you one. So this chemical trichloroethylene is widely used in degreasing and was widely used in Silicon Valley to clean off silicon wafers in many consumer electronics. In the United States, we have these, the most toxic commercial sites are known as Superfund sites. And in Silicon Valley and Mountain View, California, there are 15 of these Superfund sites along a 7-mile stretch of a freeway called the 101 freeway in Mountain View, California, which goes through some of the most expensive real estate in the entire country. And that most expensive area of real estate in the entire country has some of the most contaminated industrial, commercial, and military sites in the entire country. So you can be living in what you would think would be an area of the country that's presumably healthy and certainly wealthy, but in fact, it's really susceptible has been susceptible to water pollution, and likely because these chemicals can evaporate from groundwater, kind of like how radon evaporates from the soil, and enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces undetected. And I suspect it's still an issue today.
So what are kind of some of the ways that we can protect ourselves, on a day-to-day basis if we do live in those areas, and just in general, obviously we spoke about, talking to our representatives, but let's say, what's like something I could do maybe today, if there is anything I can do today?
There are lots of things. So one, I'll tell you what I did since I wrote the book. And I was largely ignorant of many of these issues until my colleagues and I wrote Ending Parkinson's Disease. I added a carbon filter to my water to reduce my likelihood of getting exposed to industrial chemicals or pesticides. You can just get those in the grocery store. Second, I buy a lot of organic produce. So I try to avoid pesticides as much as possible in the food that I eat. It turns out that even organic produce in the United States still has lower levels of pesticides, but still has pesticide residue on them. In some cases, the farms that produce organic produce are located next to farms that use pesticides. So I wash all my fruits and vegetables with water and a little bit of fruit and vegetable wash. I get it mine from Trader Joe's. It's like $3.99 for a bottle, and it lasts a long period of time. If you live in a polluted area, I would think about air filters for your home environment. When you drive on the freeway, I would recycle my air when I'm in the car, so I'm not drawing in polluted air from like a highway tunnel, for example. And then I would exercise. And so there's good evidence that vigorous exercise in your 30s, 40s, and 50s can decrease your risk of developing Parkinson's disease by about 20%. The equivalent is about 3.5 to 4 hours a week of like running or swimming. So a water filter for your home at home, buy organic produce if you can afford to do so. Wash all your fruits and vegetables with water and a little bit of a pesticide wash. And then use an air filter and exercise. Those are all things that you can do to lower your risk of Parkinson's disease. We put all of these and many more in our book, which provides a prescription for action that people can follow to decrease their risk of ever developing Parkinson's disease.
Wow. Okay, those are amazing. So I'm like now thinking for myself, okay, the windows that like actually the circulation of air, in the car and that's something I never thought about, but I really appreciate that. And like if you live close to a freeway, I guess the air filter piece is really important.
Yeah. So you shouldn't live near a freeway, and so there are, I think, the rules in the United States are you can't build residential buildings within, I think, 500 feet of the freeway, but those are not always followed. And you mentioned Los Angeles, and so my colleagues and I are working on another book called Losing Our Minds, in which we highlight that there are residential buildings in LA that are built at the intersection of two freeways. In Los Angeles. And so you can imagine, if you've been in Southern California, you've driven, there's always like a thin film of dirt or soot on your house, on your car. And you can imagine if that's the dirt and soot that's on your car, imagine what you're breathing in. And it turns out like when you look at smog, like in Los Angeles or in Delhi or in China, what you see are little pieces of dirt and soot that are floating in the air. And most of those particles, called particulate matter, we cough them out or we sneeze them out. But some of them are really small, like about 1/100th the size of our hair. And they can bypass our normal protective mechanisms and go up through our nose that's responsible for smell, bypass our normal protective mechanisms for our brain and enter up into the smell centers of our brain where they can spread. And hitchhiking on those pieces of dirt and soot are often toxic metals like lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And those things could be triggering the misfolding of different proteins that are responsible for Parkinson's disease and for Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. Oh my gosh. And so, okay. So
But this is all, I know people get sad. I know that this is all preventable. The nice thing of what I'm telling you is that we don't need to have a world with Parkinson's disease. We don't live in a world where there's typhus. We don't live in a world where people are dying of yellow fever. We largely live in a world that's free of polio. These are all great accomplishments that we've done over the last 100 to 200 years. We can do exactly the same thing, I think, for Parkinson's disease. We can make a world where Parkinson's disease is not the fastest growing, but the fastest decreasing. We can create a world where Parkinson's disease, I think, is very, very rare. And we can do that by just doing simple changes. What's so profound about having clean water, clean air, and clean food? These are all things that wealthy nations, certainly nations like the United States and most nations of the world, can afford to spend money to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love this so much. And I'm going to investigate like the ways that I can, make some changes right after this show, actually. But so Ray, like for folks who already have Parkinson's, let's say there's an elderly parent who has already developed Parkinson's, what are some of the treatments that are available for them?
So I think I think we can take some lessons from the smoking. So if you have lung cancer, the first thing you should do is stop smoking. And so if you have Parkinson's disease, I'd be really, really concerned about protecting the remaining nerve cells that I have. And so I would be even more diligent about buying organic, about washing my fruits and vegetables, about having a water filter, about eating a Mediterranean diet, about exercising. I think all those things apply even more in greater numbers to people with Parkinson's disease. There was even recently a small study that suggested that people with Parkinson's who lived in more polluted areas were more likely to be hospitalized for their Parkinson's than people who lived in areas with cleaner air. So I think all those things are even more important for people with the disease. Exercise, as we've really found out over the last 20 years, is especially beneficial for people with Parkinson's disease. Anything that gets your heart rate up, makes you sweat a little bit. There's something called rock steady boxing, where people box, don't strike each other in the head, but they box as a form of exercise. Yoga, Tai Chi, running, swimming, dancing are all great ways to get your heart rate up and improve your balance. And then for people who have the disease and for whom exercise isn't enough, there are medications that replace the dopamine, the neurotransmitter or chemical in the brain that's lost in Parkinson's disease. And medications like levodopa can be really beneficial. And then for a subset of people who've had Parkinson's, usually for some period of time, who respond to the well to the medications but developed complications of it, surgical treatments, including something called deep brain stimulation, can be really beneficial.
And so, Ray, can you tell us maybe one or two like anecdotal stories of folks that you've seen that have gone through some treatments and really improved, and just sort of some case studies, just so we can understand what is it like to witness someone who has Parkinson's, and how how have you seen some people kind of really take some of these action steps seriously and prevent and live a kind of good life, or continue, or be able to live a good life, even knowing that they have this?
Yeah. So for visual, people have seen the movie Awakenings that starred Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. It's actually about the development of this medication called levodopa, which took people with a rare cause of Parkinson's, likely due to an infectious pandemic around 1918. And it took people who were basically frozen in time and gave them the levodopa, and they had an awakening. People who were frozen and stiff could all of a sudden walk and dance and speak and communicate almost as if they were a normal. Unfortunately, those individuals didn't have a lasting response to the medication, but most people with Parkinson's have long periods of great response to the medication. The analogy I like to do is we don't let people with seizures continue to have seizures because we have medications that can alleviate seizures, and we shouldn't let people with Parkinson's be stiff and slow and drooling because we have medications that, for a large part, can make these individuals better. And the natural history of Parkinson's disease is that after people are diagnosed and they're appropriately treated, they're better a year later than they are when they walk in the door. And so there aren't many conditions where we can actually make people fundamentally better with neurological or brain disorders, and Parkinson's is one of them. And if you want an example of what people can accomplish with Parkinson's disease, I think the best example of that is Michael J. Fox. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's over 30 years ago, I think in his 30s. And since that time, he starred in 2 different TV series. He's written 3 different books. He's formed the foundation that's invested over $1 billion in research related to Parkinson's disease. I think he's won multiple Emmys and a lifetime Oscar award. So if you want to see what you can do with Parkinson's disease, I think Michael J. Fox is a great example of doing that. We've also had senators, congressmen and women, or congressmen, presumably women too. We've had attorney generals and others with Parkinson's disease.
Wow. So I want to talk a little bit about your own journey, Ray, and why you decided to pursue neurology, and also why you wanted to focus on Parkinson's. I'm, curious, what was the kind of inspirational path to focus on this work? I mean, it's so important, and I'm just curious, how you kind of landed on it.
Sure. So I like to joke that both my parents are psychiatrists, so I rebelled and I became a neurologist. And I became interested in Parkinson's during my neurological training because I always kind of enjoyed being around older individuals, and people with Parkinson's can get better. And that's really wonderful to see and wonderful to be able to offer to patients. And now when I see people with Parkinson's, I get a little bit pissed off because I think Parkinson's is largely preventable. And it's a debilitating disease. Over 200 Americans will be diagnosed with the disease today, and over 100 Americans will die with the disease today. And, diseases are hard, and, some things happen because of bad luck, but some things that we can prevent, we should work really, 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 really hard to prevent them so people don't have to suffer needlessly with the disease that's maybe fundamentally preventable for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what about the pandemic has maybe shifted your opinion on the space, or maybe shifted the way that you view Parkinson's, or has anything shifted since the pandemic for you?
So I think we learned a lot from the COVID-19 pandemic. It's funny, my colleagues and I, before the COVID-19 pandemic, wrote a piece called The Parkinson Pandemic, in which we highlighted that Parkinson's disease is the world's fastest growing brain disease. It's growing in virtually every part of the world. No one appears to be immune to the disease. And rather than being caused by an infectious agent like a virus, it's actually, we think, caused by numerous vectors, such as certain pesticides, industrial chemicals, and air pollution that are all tied to the Industrial Revolution and are spreading with industrialization of the world. If you actually look at the rates of Parkinson's are growing most rapidly in Southeast Asia, where use of these chemicals, air pollution, and pesticides is all increasing most rapidly. The second lesson I think we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic is what a substantial investment in resources aimed at preventing and treating the disease can do. So in the United States, we had an Operation Warp Speed where we spent tens of billions of dollars developing new vaccines and treatments for for COVID-19, and that has paid off hugely. We're largely living in a world here in early 2023 where COVID-19 is still a major issue, but it's not growing nearly as rapidly as it once was. We need to make substantial investments in Parkinson's disease and other brain diseases. I mentioned tens of billions of dollars for COVID. Right now, the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest public funder of Parkinson's disease research in the world, only spends about $250 million on Parkinson's research. By contrast, Medicare, the universal health insurance program for older Americans in the United States, spends 100 times more, $25 billion, caring for people with the disease. So we spend for every $100 we spend on research aimed at better understanding the disease, we spend $100 caring for people with the disease. If we spent more on the front end, we'd spend much less on the back end. And even if you look at the research dollars that are spent in the United States, only about 2 cents of every dollar is spent on preventing the disease. I think in the United States and the Western world, we put too much emphasis on trying to treat or cure diseases, when the better solution, the solution that we all want, is to live in a world where we don't even have to worry about the diseases, where we never get breast cancer, where we never get prostate cancer, and where we never get Parkinson's disease.
Yes, I love that so much. Wow. And so, what sort of things, looking back, have really surprised you since you've been on this journey?
When we wrote the book, I was the most aggressive about the preventable nature of Parkinson's disease, and my colleagues were a little bit more hesitant, even though one of my colleagues actually did research 20 years ago that demonstrated that chronic exposure of certain pesticides in rats reproduces the feature of Parkinson's disease. Since writing the book, I think we were understated in the book. I mentioned this Guardian article highlighting that the manufacturers of paraquat, this pesticide that's used to kill weeds, they knew about the toxic effects for the last 50 years. We're finding more and more evidence of these dry cleaning chemicals being responsible for indoor air pollution and contaminating of water. And I think we're learning more about its adverse effects of these chemicals, for example, at Camp Lejeune, at the Marine base in North Carolina. I've learned a lot more about air pollution, the role that it might be playing in Parkinson's disease, and even the greater role that it may be playing in Alzheimer's disease. So actually, I grew more encouraged that Parkinson's disease is preventable, or a large proportion of it's preventable. And I think the preventable nature of Parkinson's disease extends to other brain diseases, Alzheimer's disease. I think ALS to a large extent may be preventable, and there are many other brain diseases that we have the means to create a world in which these diseases are increasingly rare and not increasingly common.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So, Ray, who are you paying attention to in this space of Parkinson's or neurology, or kind of who you look up to, and what are some books or other resources that you might be able to recommend to our audience, besides yours, of course? And I want you to tell everyone the title of your book and where we can find it. But yeah, who else are you paying attention to, and And who do you think we should be paying attention to as well?
So I'll give you two women. The first woman is Rachel Carson, who in 1962 wrote the book Silent Spring, which launched the environmental movement. And that book, 60 years old now, she warned against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. And this is what she wrote in 1962. She said, "The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients." And it turns out that researchers since that time have identified that farmers are at 150% increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease, and that especially farmers who work with these pesticides that are known to be linked to Parkinson's disease, including this one called paraquat. And the person who led that research is the second woman, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who's a professor of neurology and an epidemiologist at the University of California, San Francisco. And I said, she's the heroine of the book, because what I did before reading the book was I had a sabbatical. And during that sabbatical, I essentially read a lot of her studies. And the more I read, the more convinced I became that Parkinson's disease is, for most people, a largely preventable disease. So I think Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring in 1962, and the research of Dr. Caroline Tanner over the last 25 to 30 years has identified numerous environmental factors that are linked to and likely responsible for Parkinson's disease. And in our book, we highlight both their stories in layperson's terms. The book is written in non-technical language. It even has a glossary. So if you don't know what DNA is or a gene is, we even tell you exactly what DNA is and what a gene is in the book. And the book is called Ending Parkinson's Disease. It's available on Amazon. All the authors are devoting their proceeds to efforts to stop and prevent Parkinson's disease. And if anyone can't afford a copy of the book, we're happy to send them one for free. They can just email us at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org with their mailing address, and we'll send them a complimentary copy of the book.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Ray. And then what do you want to kind of tell our listeners about their wellness and well-being? What's sort of your main takeaway here? And also, what are you working on next? You mentioned another book.
So I'll say what we're working on next. So we're working on a book called Losing Our Minds. Turns out that 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 65 currently have either Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. A woman's lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, I think, is at least 1 in 10. Our lifetime risk of developing Parkinson's disease for men, which is a little bit more common in men than women, is about 1 in 15. These are diseases that aren't going away unless we change their course. The only way we can change their course is the way that we've changed the course of other diseases in the past, and that's through activism and making our voices heard. So in the 1930s, we lived in a world where polio shut down swimming pools, churches, and community centers. And in response to that, people formed a March of Dimes in 1938, which people actually mailed in dimes to the White House to raise money to develop a vaccine for polio. And 16 years after the March of Dimes, Jonas Salk and then later Albert Sabin developed vaccines that have largely eradicated polio from almost every part of the world. In the 1980s, we were confronted with another unknown virus that was uniformly and rapidly fatal, and it was affecting predominantly men in New York City and San Francisco. And in the face of that, HIV activists adopted a motto of silence equals death, because for them, if they stayed silent, they and their friends were dying of the disease. And they changed the course of the disease, and we now live in a world where HIV is not only preventable, but it's highly treatable. And the same thing can be said of women whose children were dying in automobile accidents at the hands of drunk drivers. And they said, we don't need better emergency rooms or better trauma centers or better spinal cord injury rehab centers, which we might need. But they said, we simply need to stop drinking and driving. And they made it socially unacceptable to drink and drive, at least in the United States and hopefully in most parts of the world. And so when we make our voices heard, we can make diseases almost go away, like polio. We can make diseases preventable, like HIV. And and we can make diseases like drunken driving socially unacceptable. We just need to do exactly the same thing for Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and for a wide range of other brain diseases.
Wow. So can we actually just talk a little bit about Alzheimer's, since we spent most of the show talking about Parkinson's? Are some of the same kind of call to action similar to, to preventing Alzheimer's, the water, the environmental piece, or is there more that we can do with Alzheimer's?
I think for Alzheimer's, the big issue here is air pollution. So I'll give you another woman, Dr. Calderon Garcia-Duenas was a young, precocious physician from Mexico, and in the 1990s in Mexico City had the worst air pollution in the world, and she was concerned about the effects of air pollution on the brain. So she looked at the brains of young children and young adults who died either in car accidents or from gun violence. And she looked at 203 consecutive brains of people from as young as 11 months old to as old as 40. And she found the signatures of Alzheimer's disease, the pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, in 202 of those 203 brains, suggesting that air pollution might be a significant factor in the development of Alzheimer's disease. And when she was done looking at children and young adults, she looked at the brains of dogs, and she looked at the brains of dogs who lived in Mexico City, and the brains of dogs who lived in a much less polluted part of Mexico. And she found that the brains of dogs in Mexico City were far, far more likely to have these pathological hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, this misfolded protein called beta amyloid, than dogs who lived in cleaner and then in parts of Mexico with much cleaner air.
Wow. And can you also say her name one more time, Dr. Duenas?
Yeah, Dr. Lilian Calderon Garcia-Duenas. She's now at the University of Montana, where I presume she breathes in very clean air compared to that in Mexico City.
Wow. Incredible. And where can people find you, Ray, or where can people find your book? And is there any other place that you'd like folks to navigate to?
Yeah, so they can find our book on Amazon or in your library or in some bookstores. It's just called Ending Parkinson's Disease. Again, all authors are donating all our proceeds to efforts to stop the disease. If you can't afford it, or if you have a question about the disease or about Parkinson's, you can just email me at info@endingpd.org. And then we have a website and a newsletter you can sign up for at endingpd.org. Or again, the easy thing is just to email me at info@endingpd.org and say you want to be on our newsletter, and we'll put you on there.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Ray. This was so lovely, and I've learned so much. I'm sure that folks listening are also going to be, really listening closely to these call to actions and shifting their life. And yeah, I sincerely hope this catalyzes a lot more, people to help end this disease, both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, for devoting so much time and effort to improving our brain's health and our wellness.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about ending Parkinson's disease with Dr. Ray Dorsey. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and consciousness. Thanks again.